Ever have one of those games you played as a kid that's just a hazy, surreal memory? You can recall parts of it and how you felt playing it, but not enough to figure out the name? Well, I have, and for me, this is one of those games. Fairy Tale Adventure Book 1, developed and published by Micro Illusions in 1987 for the Commodore Amiga. Though I was familiar with this version of FTA, the MS-DOS port from 1989. A colleague of my dad's had this on his office computer when I was about 5 years old, and the game has been burned into my gray matter ever since. Granted, I never got to explore its 17,000 screens since I didn't have long to play with it, but it was a weirdly powerful and long-lasting memory nonetheless. I randomly ran across a screenshot online the other day, the light bulb went off, and finally I was reunited with this bizarre childhood experience. Inside the box, you get a game on 3 voluptuous 5 1/4 inch floppy disks, or 2 petite 3.5 inch disks, and of course you get a manual covering the basic operation of the game and what the goal is. But you also get a larger booklet covering the backstory of the game, who you are and why you're doing what you're doing, which is useful since the endgame intro is a tad short on details. The story is that there's a peaceful land called home, where 3 brothers and their father exist and do fairy tale things. But of course, one day an evil necromancer shows up to be a douche and screws up everything, and also happens to steal a talisman of ambiguous importance and capture the king's daughter, because why not? Since the brother's father is the master-at-arms, he sets off to try and save the day. It doesn't work, he dies, and it's up to the bros to go on a brotacular quest to find the missing talisman and kill the douche romancer. To further flesh things out, it even comes with a fold-out map of the game world that doubles as the game's copy protection scheme, which we'll get to right now, actually. On starting the game, you'll be asked to answer 3 questions to prove yourself as advisor to the game's protagonists. Look on the map and you'll see a creed of sorts surrounding the edges that you'll need to recite parts of to the game before it actually lets you play. And this is fantastic. I love when games make an extra effort to get you into the lore like this, even if it's just a clever way of treating your customer like a potential thief. After that, you get a short storybook intro, which is completely redundant if you've already read the story booklet. And of course you have, because you were dropping a log earlier and read the crap out of that thing. At least I did. Once that's over with, you take control of the first brother, Julian, in the small village of Tambri. The gameplay is all seen from a top-down perspective, and you might say it's a bit reminiscent of some of the early 90s Ultima games. You can move around using the keyboard, joystick, or mouse, and interact with the environment using commands that wouldn't be out of place in a point-and-click adventure. You know, look at this, talk to them, use that, fart on these, etc. You have an inventory as well, so things start off like countless other CRPGs, walking around every nook and cranny in town in search of sweet loot. No one seems to care though, so I guess there's some form of high fantasy socialism going on. In the bottom left of the screen, you get a status bar, providing a live update of what you're doing as well as your current stats. From left to right, you have bravery, which is your fighting strength, luck, which is something we'll get to later, kindness, which determines how NPCs feel about you and changes with your actions, vitality, which is your health, and wealth, which is your fat stacks of cash money. Searching the town will eventually provide some items to augment your abilities, like vials for regenerating health, skulls that kill nearby enemies, keys of differing colors for different doors, totems for revealing your place on the map, and so on. But one thing you won't run across in town are weapons, unless you buy them, and you can't because your blue-collar self is flat broke. So you're armed with nothing but a tiny dirk. Do you have a tiny dirk? A tiny knife, and you'll no doubt run across some bandits or skeletons or something that hopefully have better weapons on them. If you can dispatch them without dying, great. Chances are you won't though, at least not without a bit of practice, because the combat system is, how do I put this? It makes me want to rip the hair out of my arms with a spoon. You not only have to face the exact direction of the enemy, but move towards them with your weapon and swing it around at the same time. Which makes me feel like I'm flailing around like the puppets in Team America. It just doesn't feel like I'm fighting so much as it does having a seizure. But whatever, eventually you kind of get the hang of it, and when you're successful, you'll gain a little more to your bravery stats, which act kind of like combat skill points. If not, you'll die, and if you have enough luck, a dinky little fairy will come sauntering in to bring you back to life. But eventually you'll run out of luck, and when that happens, you're dead for good. You lose all your items and experience, and you have to start back at the beginning with the next brother. Once all 3 broskies are dead, it's game over, where apparently the moral of the story is to just stay at home. And you know, that's not such a bad idea. I can live with that. Because while playing as 3 brothers with slightly differing stats seems like a neat concept, it's pretty much pointless here. Like I said, if you die, you lose everything you've earned, starting off as a complete wimp with no possessions. And you can't just go around looting the town again if you did so with a previous brother, since it doesn't seem to regenerate loot. It's all still gone. So you're stuck with a weak character and no useful gear, and when you learn that, you'll start to cherish that first brother's life quite a bit more, saving your game right after every fight to keep your gear and precious bravery points intact. Once you've got a brother's back long enough to get some decent stat points and junk, it's not particularly challenging to stay alive and explore the massive landscape, even with the clumsy combat controls. In short, unless something terribly accidental happens, you become too strong to die. It's at this point that you come to a disturbing realization. This is one of the most boring of giant game worlds ever conceived. Sure, it may be an absolutely massive 17,000 screens big. In fact, the game was considered to be the single largest game world ever made when it came out. The problem is that 90% of the time you'll be wandering around doing absolutely nothing at all. Just walking and floating around on this piece of wood. 9% of the rest of the time is spent fighting off random spawns of the same dull enemies over and over, and the final 1% is actually interacting with something that advances the story. You do have some music to keep you company, although it's just blaring PC speaker tones in this version. Yeah, actually, it wears out its welcome pretty fast, and I would just turn it off, but it happens to change tunes to something more menacing when enemies are nearby, which is quite useful. What would be even more useful is the ability to run, but sorry, no such luck. There is a mystical golden swan creature that you can get later on that lets you move around more quickly, which is nice, but it does nothing to help the game world feel any more alive. Rarely do you run across any NPCs that are even slightly interesting. And even worse, you have to worry about hunger and resting when you're exploring, or else you'll starve or pass out. No meter or stat points to let you know about this status either, so you're just kind of stuck waiting for the game to tell you you're suffering. There is the occasional piece of food to take with you at least, but I never found a way to safely sleep while on the go. You've also got a day and night cycle to deal with, which is pretty innovative for the time and all, but it makes it much harder on the eyes, and the combat suffers even more as a result. And since you can't rest on command, well, you'll just have to deal with it. Yeah, all of this combines to make a game that is highly interesting on a surface level, but the actual gameplay fails to deliver when you get slightly deeper. Technically, I think it's pretty impressive, as there's no loading when roaming this absolutely huge map, it all just streams in as you play. And there are several unique locations throughout it that I can appreciate, like castles, lost cities, and caves. I happen to like castles, lost cities, and caves, so that's cool. But everywhere in between ends up feeling like exactly the same dead and lifeless locale as the last. It's not until countless hours into the game that you finally pick up the story and enter the astral plane and all that, but dealing with the monotonous slog of practically everything else in the game to get to the interesting stuff hardly seems worth it. And then there's some stuff that might seem interesting that's just not here at all, like whatever happened to that missing Red Knight? The storybook even tells you to seek the guidance of this guy, but no, turns out he's got nothing to do with anything. That seems to be the story behind most of this game's content. It's got nothing to do with anything. There are some overarching ideas that sound brilliant at first, but in practice it's just weak. Yes, the game has bright and colorful graphics, following the story can be fun once you finally figure out how, and it absolutely captivated my imagination as a kindergartner. But now, I'm sorry, I just can't. Other than the nostalgia factor, there isn't a single reason I can think of to recommend giving this one a go to my fellow retro gamers today. Back in the late 80s, it was pretty spectacular in many ways. But simply put, there are far better classic CRPGs to spend your time with now that we have the choice. So, Fairy Tail Adventure. Man, all those years wondering what it was, only to find out I'd probably have more fun eating the floppy disks than installing them. Sometimes, it's just better to leave your memories alone.